Good afternoon. My name is Allison Listis, and I serve as assistant to the bishop and director of advocacy. And we are here this afternoon to talk about gun violence in our synod. Before we get started with some of the questions, I've invited some extraordinary pastors from Tennessee to join us and talk about their work and what they've been doing regarding gun violence. Pastor Matt, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Allison. Thank you for putting this forum together for us. My name is Matt Steinhauer, and I am the interim pastor at St. Andrew Lutheran Church in Franklin, Tennessee. And I'll call on Pastor Kathy Crimmy.
Hi, I'm Pastor Kathy Crimmy. I serve Christ Lutheran Church in Clarksville, Tennessee. Pastor Rick Roberts.
Yes, Rick Roberts, pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church here in Nashville. And again, thanks, Allison. And Pastor Ann.
I too am thankful to you, Allison, for kind of rounding us up. I'm the Reverend Dr. Ann Bassett, and I am currently serving as the pastor of Peace Lutheran Church in Spring Hill, Tennessee. Julian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Julian Gordy, and I'm retired. I am currently doing some supply work at Memorial Lutheran Church in Nashville, Tennessee.
Fantastic. Thank you. It is a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. And thank you for thanking me, but I need to thank all of you for your work and your participation in this gun violence crisis that we are in the midst of. So just so our viewers know, this is just going to be a conversation, and we're going to get started. What inspired you to get involved with gun violence rallies and advocacy?
Because there's way too much gun violence in our world. And the only voices that are being heard are the voices for pro-guns, and not enough voices speaking out, against guns and the violence that they are causing.
Thanks, Pastor Rick.
I have always had a distaste for guns. And I've always thought, at one time I was a huge tobacco reform activist. And then when smoking was no longer allowed in restaurants and stuff, that kind of went away. And I always thought my next cause that I would take on would be gun reform. But I was always kind of scared to do that because, well, they have guns. But so I was on vacation when the Covenant School shooting happened. And so when that happened in my backyard, so to speak, I just thought, I cannot be silent anymore. And I knew that there were rallies and marches and protests and all that going on, and I was out of town. And so when I got back, it turned out to be Holy Week. But I just thought, when history is all said and done, I want to be able to say that I came down on the right side of this and that I was not silent. And so I just went for it.
Pastor Ann.
So for me, being a mother of 3 children and a grandmother of 5 more wonderful grandkids, and after having met with a panel of young adults in Washington, D.C. a few years ago, one of whom was a student at the Parkland School when that shooting occurred, and listening to her experience and her real challenge that she felt like people around her, the adults around her, loved her very dearly, but yet they were unwilling to do anything to stop the gun violence that led to that shooting. And she and her friends just really did not want to have to go to school every day, wondering if that was going to be the last day of their life. I also had the opportunity a number of years before that to do the FBI tour in Washington, D.C., where they take you down to the shooting range and show you what happens when they shoot various weapons. And while I have any number of friends and family members who are hunters, and I support their use of guns in hunting, while I don't believe I need a gun for protection, I honor those people who who do feel they need. I just don't understand the assault weapons, and when you look at what they do to our children in these shootings, I can't stay silent.
Pastor Kathy?
You know, for me, I mean, I've always tried to be involved in any social justice issue I can, and advocate at our state capitol and with our local elected representatives. I think that's part of my calling as a Christian, part of my baptismal vows, specifically say to do justice and peace, and my ordination vows kind of say the same. So I really don't have an option not to do it. I think it's a matter of how involved I get. And in this case, the morning of the shooting at Covenant School, the first thing I thought of was I had just discovered the church where that school was located about 2 months before the shooting. I used to live in that neighborhood, and I was driving through there, and I hadn't been through there in a number of years. And this is this huge, beautiful Presbyterian church, big stone edifice. And so I immediately thought, gosh, that's that church that that's in my neighborhood. And then about 20, 30 minutes later, my daughter, Lindsay, who my granddaughter was taking food therapy. She's 5 years old. And Lindsay said that Merritt's afternoon class was canceled because one of the therapists that worked there, her mom was the mother of one of the children that was shot. And so it became honestly just sort of personal to me. I mean, I have grandchildren that are the ages of those children that were shot. And then I think seeing the violence of that AR-15 blasting through the glass doors of that school made me realize that it is just an evil weapon. It has no place in the hands of a layperson. I mean, that's what I consider any of us who are not in the military as lay people. And so I decided this was an issue I was just going to have to be present physically at, and so that's what prompted me.
Thank you, Pastor Matt. Julian, do you have anything you'd like to add?
You know, unlike Ann, I have not always had a distaste for guns. I grew up in the country in West Georgia, where I think every evening, if I was sitting on our couch, behind me there was a shotgun. They were all hunting weapons. And I think Allison, I told you the story that when I was about 10 or 11, my cousin Joel, who was 10 years older than I, was arrested because he had in his possession a shotgun with a barrel that was shorter than, I think it was 18 inches. This was in rural West Georgia, where people in the 50s figured out there was something wrong with a weapon that was made just to hurt people, not to so there was a real distinction between hunting guns and other guns, and we've moved with, I think, a lot of assistance from the NRA from the point where we were able to make that distinction, and as Matt said, recognize those weapons that were not made for lay people but were made to kill, to the point where this has become normal. Part of that was a Supreme Court decision that overturned several previous decisions. But I think my concern is that this has now become kind of normal in the U.S. Of course, I've traveled out of the country in several different places, and everybody else thinks we're nuts. But for us, it's become normal, and I hate to see it become normal. It shouldn't be normal for a lot of reasons. One of those is the fear that it brings to all of us, including our children. And I just read this week. One of the ways people are dealing with so many people buying weapons is by buying weapons. So it's kind of like the nuclear arms race. The problem, there was an old cartoon in the 50s. The problem with the bomb is that then you have to have a bigger bomb in case those people have that bomb, and then a bigger bomb, and it keeps going until everybody's armed to the teeth. That ought to be a real problem for Christians. if we feel like we need to be ready to take the lives of our neighbors all the time, there's something wrong with that, and that's become normal, I'm afraid. So I guess that's what my motivation is. I'd like to see the fear tamped down, especially for young people, but for all of us.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just share my connection. So yes, gun violence falls under the purview of advocacy. However, it became very personal last August when my husband's sister was shot and killed by her husband before he killed himself. So that made this not just personal, but imperative that we deal with some of this. So I appreciate your answers. Thank you.
Can I add just a thing?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't have any children in school age and don't have grandchildren, but we partner with a couple schools in our community. And especially after the Covenant school shooting here in Nashville, just went up to the school immediately, and they let me in because they know who I am. And it was just seeing the tears and the fears, in their eyes. It's just, that's, I got involved with rallies and stuff before that, but that's what keeps me going. And then talking to members of my congregation here who had their child go to school for the very first time this year and was very worried. Like someone else said, are they going to come home? And so we have to get our voice out, of reality.
Absolutely.
So I think that's another important thing that we all have kind of tagged on to school shootings, but we need to remember that churches are another place where there are a lot of mass shootings. And as pastors, I'm concerned about that. We have conversations. And so not only protecting our schools, but protecting our churches and protecting our other public places too, like Walmart and the movie theater and concerts and all those other places need to be safe places to gather.
And I think too that's part of the importance of education and doing what we're doing, because the governor of Tennessee called a special session that will happen, of course, next week, and I'm certain there will be a lot of attention paid to and words given to making schools safer as addressing the gun violence problem. Make schools safer by putting more armed guards at schools. But that does not even touch all of the other public places where shootings happen all the time. Concerts, grocery stores, movie theaters. I mean, it's everywhere. And so you can't make schools safer and address the gun violence problem.
Well, I think there's two parts of that too. People who are not as concerned about this, let's say, will often say the chances of being killed in a mass shooting are very, very slim, and they are compared to, say, the chances of being in an auto accident or something. But they are dozens and in fact hundreds of times more than they are anywhere else in the world. And whether it's a real common or not, it's too common, and it also ramps up that fear that we live by. And as the fear gets ramped up, as I said earlier, I think people then begin to try to protect themselves. And as people begin to try to protect themselves, the problem gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Right. Thank you. In what ways do you see that participating in rallies as a way to live out the gospel and the Lutheran values of peace and justice and compassion?
So one of the things for me that's really important about my faith is living in community with other people. And I guess coupled with that, for many of my adult years, I've listened to people comment that if I raised an issue, oh, that's just your problem. It's not anybody else's. Nobody else is speaking out about it. So it can't be that important. And I guess to me, attending rallies and coming together as communities to hopefully change our world for the better, it reminds those who fight these changes that it isn't just one person complaining. It is a more invasive problem in our society.
Thank you.
Yeah, you know, for me, I think it's the public witness.
Mm.
And then probably this does dovetail with Pastor Kathy's suggestion that you're somewhat locking arms with other people who are also interested in those same values. I know that the rally in the state capitol, after it, in the immediate aftermath of the Covenant School shooting, there were many pastors that were there, and the parents with young children, I know, were appreciative of that moral and spiritual support that we offered there. So I think from a pastoral perspective, that's a reason. But then I think, beyond wearing a collar, I think just showing up with your neighbors who have this deep need for something that's very important is a way to bear witness that we are all in this together.
And I think one of the key words in that question is to live out the gospel. And the gospel is good news.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about it, we preach about it every week. But I think people need to see the gospel in action, see the good news, not just what they hear me say or hear us say, is what they see us doing to live out the good news, to make change, to bring more hope and peace into this crazy world that we have, to bring God's peace, shalom, peace for everyone, for every circumstance, justice, God's justice of love, and have compassion, for people. So we really, we have to preach it, but we also have to live it. And I believe by participating in those rallies is a way people can see that this is important to us, not just words.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, Matt said it's part of our vows that we took to fight for justice. And I think what Rick said is about walking the talk is really important. But I also believe that no form of government is perfect. And even a democracy can be ineffective and sometimes dangerous form of government in the absence of a studied attention of an informed citizenry. So, we often take great pride and even sometimes exaggerated comfort in the fact that we live in a democratic society, but it's easy to forget that our government needs tending to, and it cannot be put on autopilot and left to function unobserved and unattended. And so that's part of that two kingdoms that we as Lutherans believe in, that our God-given responsibility is to be in checks and balances with our government, and to make sure that our government is protecting those that are the most vulnerable, the marginalized, and those who are left on the periphery of our society. And that's who we're called to stand up for. That's who Jesus came to stand up for and to heal and to be present with. And so that is our Christian mandate.
Thank you.
I wouldn't disagree with anything at all that's been said. And I think some of that's pretty profound. And especially this notion that in a democracy, when I've done marching and rallies, which goes way back into the 60s, not that I'm old, but one of the reasons for doing that, in addition to the community solidarity and so forth, is to let the people who are making laws know that there are people who have this idea. And especially now, I think, where, in Tennessee, for instance, a vast majority of people want common sense gun control. And yet our legislature has absolutely no interest in that. So they need to know that there are people who know that they're not doing that. And at the risk of, seeming like maybe a bit of a wet blanket, I think there's a caution here. And that is that, and again, I say this not just about this issue, but going back for years, that sometimes rallies become kind of salve for us. We went and did that, and And so we've been on the right side, when in fact, that notion in the baptismal vows of working for justice and peace in all the world, that word work is important here.
Mhm.
And I don't think that many laws have ever been changed by rallies. They've been changed by really hard legislative work. And that, Morgan and I have this conversation regularly. My concern with rallies is, that's like raising the flag. That's not taking the hill. And
Right.
so it's important to make that public witness that Rick is talking about, but it's also important that not be all that we are doing, because I think then we get to feel pretty good about ourselves, while at the same time neglecting the really hard work that we're called on to do.
Right. It's not just a box to check
It's not.
and a little pat on your back. Look at
You,
me.
you said that in one sentence. It took me.
Well,
That's okay. You were much more eloquent than I was.
and I think that brings up the tension for us as pastors to of the whole question and notion of being too political in our public witness, even if we use words from the pulpit that might seem political. And I heard, and this was such a great reminder to me that saying the phrase "Jesus is Lord" is a political statement in the context of the Roman Empire, a statement that could get you killed. And so for anyone to say that, you can't be political, you can't be, I heard my former esteemed Bishop Emeritus say, it's different being political and being partisan. You can't be partisan, but you can certainly be political. And I think, this issue is an important time for pastors to be bold, to bring up the reality that these things will not change. As Julian said, the rally is raising the flag, but charging the hill is going to the state capitol and calling the legislators and state senators and again and again and again, and hopefully moving that needle to where something does finally get done.
So
That to me is I'm sorry. That to me is the hardest part in being involved in these protests and rallies, is that it is a long, hard slog. But I think as a woman, if Susan B. Anthony and Catherine Stanton hadn't been an activist for over 100 years. I mean, they never saw their dream come to fruition in their lifetime. If they hadn't stuck with it, though, I probably would not be able to vote today. And I think it had a huge impact in ending the Vietnam War. And of course, it had a major impact in civil rights. So I have a friend of me who says, I don't know why you do that. It doesn't make any difference. Nothing ever changes. And I think, no, just one rally, one protest, it doesn't change, but it's much more complicated than that. And you have to be in it for the long haul, because it is a long, hard slog.
And the part about trying to not be too political, I think if people knew how political some guy named Jesus was, they might not, they might have a different view of that. But our world has forgotten who Jesus is and who he was and what he stood for. I believe. And so maybe this is part of that, is helping people understand the politicalness of Jesus, but his politics of love, and nonviolence.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for your thoughtful answers. How does your faith inform your perspective on gun violence and the responsibility to advocate for change?
I just think Jesus came to give life, and to give life abundantly, and guns don't do that.
And I was going to say, that's what God and Jesus have always tried to get our world to do. From Genesis 3 on.
And yeah, God and Jesus want every human being and all of creation to flourish. And I'm sorry, but when you watch people being mowed down by assault weapons, that is not flourishing.
Flourishing is changing those weapons into plowshares. you know,
Right.
and
When
feeding
you
people.
talk to the emergency room people who had to identify the bodies of those children from Covenant School and had to do it by the shoes they were wearing, that's not flourishing.
Right.
And I think flourishing also means living a life without fear. And as Julian mentioned earlier, our reaction in many, well, I mean, it's either the economics of the National Rifle Association kind of bear this out that, when a shooting happens, more guns are bought. People try to soothe their fears by gunning up. And I think that's not flourishing to live in this state of fear. I thought about a couple of Sundays ago when at St. Andrew we did our annual blessing of the backpacks, blessing of the children that were going off to school. And I've done that almost every year I was a pastor, and for the first time I'm sitting there thinking, how real this is. And when Pastor David Hood prayed to keep these children safe, I mean, just these images that go through my mind. That's not a flourishing life to live that way. And if we are a Christian nation, which so many say that we are, then the momentum and the voice of the Christians really should outweigh the voice of those who think that bearing arms is the way to answer all of our problems. I certainly don't see that happening. So,
Well, unfortunately, though, I think that the majority of the people who are refusing to consider any sort of measures for gun control are people who do think of themselves as Christians.
Yeah.
I saw a bumper sticker. Maybe you've seen it too. A picture of it has made the rounds that said, if Jesus had an AK-40, an AR-15, he wouldn't have had to die, which kind of misses several points, but
Just one or two.
yeah, but that's the level of theological thinking that's going on here, I'm afraid. And I think, I'm not sure that creating that this has to do with Christian versus non-Christian. I mean, I think there are Christians on both sides of this. The issue, however, it seems to me is a lot clearer. You all are probably familiar with the novelist Marilyn Robinson, who wrote Gilead. If you're not and you haven't read Gilead, I'd really recommend it. But when one of the recent shootings in one of the schools happened, she said that the reason she wouldn't carry a gun is because it's an immoral act walking around imagining that you're going to kill someone. And then she went on to say it's a recipe for a completely deranged society. And I think you could take that point of view whether you're a Christian or not. Marilyn Robinson is very much so, but I think the issue, I mean, we can't claim moral high ground as Christians here because the vast majority of people who are on everybody has a right to have whatever weapon they want side call themselves Christians as well.
Thank you.
I remember at one of the rallies I was at, there was this very articulate young African-American woman who basically said, where have all you people been all this time? I, in my neighborhood, deal with gun violence all the time and for years and years and years. And why are you just now showing up? And so I volunteer at an organization that works with women who live in the oldest and poorest projects here in Nashville. And so I just asked them, what is your experience with gun violence? And there are two things that really bubbled up as I was listening to them. And one is their deep, deep concern for the young people in their community who are being conditioned that the best way to respond for any conflict is with a gun. That's just the normal. That's the standard operating procedure. You've got an argument, you go for the gun. And then the other thing was for me to hear them, how hyper vigilant they are all the time about where they are, who's around them, who's behind them, and how when they sit out on their porch and they see something a little going on, boy, they hightail it into their apartment, and how just that hyper vigilant of their surroundings at all times. I thought, how exhausting that must be. And how can that be a life that, to use Matt's term, is flourishing? And how can that be abundant life? But I really was called to task by what that young woman said about, where have you guys been all this time? Where, this has been going on for eons, and it's time to do something about it.
And, I wonder where it went wrong in the education system, because I don't think our kids are taught anymore how to deal with other kids' opinions. There's one answer, it's your answer, and that's what you go with. And it's kind of like everybody gets a trophy. So if somebody differs in opinion, rather than understanding how to ask questions and seek to understand, it just becomes a conflict, and let's just pull out a gun.
Well,
And I
but
don't
it's
know.
not just the education system's responsibility. It's all of
Oh,
our
absolutely.
responsibilities in our families. How do we hold conversations? And we all know, I mean, I come from a very large extended family, and I had an uncle for years that told me that anybody that any women that were ordained or anybody that supported them were all going to hell. And as I was
Right.
going through candidacy, that continued, and I had to learn to say, I don't agree with you. I love you. You've been my uncle. We have to learn how to deal with people,
Right.
even when we may not ever be able to change their minds. How do we interact with them in a respectable way?
Right. And I think that's something we need to learn. I don't know that that's an innate skill that everyone has.
I think it's interesting that you should bring that point up in the current issue of the Atlantic, and I think you can get this online. David Brooks has an article, and the title of it is "How America Got So Mean," and he says that it's because we've now had generations that were growing up without having been taught how not to be that way, how to deal with each other, how to talk to each other, how to disagree with one another. And that's bad enough, but then you add guns to that, and there's an instant way of addressing that. One thing that hasn't been mentioned, just real quickly, one of the issues that is particular to guns, I think, here is that with almost anything else that we have at our disposal, when we lose our temper, there's a possibility of some short-term harm, but not permanent harm. And guns make this is really important where young people are concerned, because at least we're talking about school shootings and such, but there are a lot more young people killed from one shooting another in an argument somewhere every day. Those that Ann is talking about in those communities where this is happening, and that's expanding now into the suburbs for those of us who flee there, because that's what and it's a permanent error if you make that error.
Yeah, sure is.
Make that error. Another reason to have some more control over how common those are.
I just have one more question to close us on. How do you, as a pastor, how are you hoping to get your congregations and other individuals involved in this? Has your experience gotten them more involved? And if not, how would you like to see them involved?
So I usually start with, I'm always curious about how people think about topics like this, or really any topic that is controversial. So opening up conversation, and hoping to encourage conversation that's respectful is this, and letting them know what I'm involved in. And what opportunities they have to join us in.
Yeah, I think it's just being open to talk about the issues, whether it's gun violence, gun control, or whatever, creating a safe place for people to come, and hopefully agree to disagree, but to also learn, to get back to what we're called to be as the Church of Jesus Christ, as Christians, or as I like to say, as followers of Jesus, because I think there's a huge difference.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation, Pastor Rick.
But you have to, I believe we have to just open conversations, have those conversations. And they're not easy to have, because a lot of people at St. John's and everywhere else probably has a lot of guns. And I'm sure there's a few people, packing on Sunday morning. So we got to have those conversations in education. And I think especially about, as I said earlier, who Jesus was and what he and God stands for.
Yeah, I think it's about opening up those spaces for conversations. As much as I would love for it to go beyond conversations and it would go to walking the talk, I've just found that most of my congregants work. I mean, they can't be gone in the middle of the day to attend a protest and a rally. That's why the favorite event that I participated happened in the evening. It happened at 5:30, and it was so incredibly well organized, where we joined hands from Vanderbilt Children's Hospital all the way to the state capitol. It was in the evening, people could show up. We had 9,000 people here in Nashville show up to do that, and it was just wonderful. And of course, we're hoping that tons of people will show up on Monday morning when we do our prayer train around the state capitol. But people just can't get off work to do that. And also, and I encourage people to write letters or to call their legislatures. Sometimes it's hard for them to do that as well, to know what to say. So I often offer to provide sample letters and to say, this is what I wrote. You're welcome to use it and edit it and sign your own name or whatever the case may be. I think it's also important just to listen. Oh, I want to back up and say, I have a hard time being in protest as the pastor of Peace Lutheran Church, because I realize that not everybody at Peace Lutheran Church feels the way I do. And I do not represent all the people in my congregation. I feel like I have a moral obligation according to, what God calls us to do, my baptismal vows, my ordination vows, to advocate for justice. So as a pastor and as an ordained person, I feel obligated to speak out, but I don't represent all of those whom I shepherd. But I found it interesting. I have a young couple who own 2 AR-15s, not 1, but 2. But it was back in the day before Tennessee deregulated what you had to do to get one. He had to spend $1,000 to have background checks, to go through training and all this kind of stuff to have his AR-15s. Well, now you don't have to do any of that. And he wants his $1,000 back, which I don't blame him. But the other thing that's interesting to hear him talking is they now have a 4-month-old beautiful little girl, but they're thinking about homeschooling her. They don't want her to go to school because they're worried about gun violence. And I'm thinking, these are the kind of people I want our legislatures to hear from. You know what I mean? These are people that want their Second Amendment rights protected, but at the same time, they've shifted in how they feel about guns. And I haven't figured it out yet, but I would love to be able to get this young couple in front of our legislatures and for them to be heard.
Any other thoughts? Thank you all very much for your time. I think this is going to be a very helpful conversation, and I hope it won't be the last conversation that we have together. Since you all are pastors, would one of you like to close us in prayer?
I think our dean will do that.
Oh, I was just about going to say the Bishop Emeritus. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Also with you.
Good and gracious God, thank you for this beautiful day that you have given us, because every day is a day that you have given us. We thank you for our callings. We thank you for the many blessings you give to your entire world. Help us to know those blessings. Help us to teach those blessings. Help us to live those blessings, to help change our world to be more like Jesus, to be more like your love, and equip and empower us to be your prophetic voice, to bring more hope and peace, into our gun-ridden world. Just bless us and keep us and help us to follow your ways always. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.